Hi, and welcome to Hoffman's Hot Seat. I'm Tom Hoffman with One-to-One Media. Joining me today is Brian Curran, Vice President of Web Customer Experience Solutions at RightNow. Brian has an extensive background in customer experience management, including a series of positions with BestBuy and other companies. Today we'll be discussing how Brian is leveraging those experiences and applying that to his role at RightNow. Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
And thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Brian, you've held a series of customer experience officer titles at BestBuy and other companies. How are you able to draw upon those experiences and apply that to your role at RightNow?
Well, like you said, Tom, I've had a very varied background with many companies and had a lot of experience in the call center, in building websites, in managing retail stores, and a lot of different operational pieces. And one of the things I understand about companies is I really understand their goals and what they're trying to achieve. And for me, it's a great opportunity to sit down with business leaders and really talk about what is it they're trying to achieve. In a lot of cases, what I found is when software companies sat down with me in the past, they'd start talking about an application, or they'd be down, a little bit too tactical. And what I really wanted to make sure is that they understood my business, and we could have a conversation about what is it I was really trying to achieve. And I think, the chance to apply my background around marketing, around sales, around operations, around web design, around call centers really brings a lot of value to those conversations.
What would you say are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned during your tenure in these different customer-facing organizations and in your roles there? And how do those experiences continue to influence you?
Well, I think having the opportunity to work with BestBuy, who I believe is just at the forefront of customer centricity, I really got a chance to see firsthand what it meant to be a customer-centric company. And when you talk about customer experience and customer centricity, I really look at those as the same light. And one of the great things about BestBuy is that they were super focused on people, and they thought about people, processes, and technology. But people first. And to them, people meant customers and it meant employees. And so they were super focused on, one, really understanding those customers in detail and really going through in-depth knowledge, research, and really trying to understand not just the geodemographics of those customers, but really trying to understand the behaviors, the needs of those customers. And then we had a saying around BestBuy that was, well, if the customer's king, then the closest to the customer must be royalty. So they thought that the frontline employees were really royalty. And so in that case, it was really our job to equip that royalty with the very best tools and capabilities in order to deliver that experience. BestBuy, I think, was at the forefront of the thought process around multi-channel strategy. So it wasn't just about the bricks, the retail stores, but it was really about the web. BestBuy understood that 70% of the customers came and did research online first before they went to the store. They understood how important it was to actually take the phone calls. And what was interesting is BestBuy spent a lot of time really trying to understand the journey that a customer went through in the relationship they had with the brand, because brand really mattered. So, to give you an example, Tom, is that a customer might start on the process of identifying their need. They might do a little bit of research. They'll go through an evaluation process of determining what products. They might make a decision at that point. They might even go through a little bit of buyer's remorse. Then they decide to buy the product, right, and pay for it. And then they have to have it delivered, and they have to have it installed, and then they have to learn more about the product, and they have to maintain it, and upgrade it, and enhance it, and accessorize it, and repair. And then there's a disposal process, and they start all over again. And it's a very complex step-by-step process that customers go through. And they pick a different channel every time for every bit of the process. And so if you look at that complexity, it was extremely important, one, to have thorough knowledge about what that interaction was like for the customer through every channel, every experience. So not to sound long-winded, but when I look at that background and that experience that I had, it now gives me a very interesting insight that when I sit down with companies, I'm not talking about just, okay, how are you going to sell more product, but I'm really talking about how are you going to build that long-term relationship with that customer and ensure that you don't have drop-off points in your relationship that tarnish your brand. And so when we start talking about customer experience and we start talking about using multiple channels, I can look at their business and ask all the right questions about, okay, well, then what happens to a customer? Okay, and then what happens? Okay, and then 6 months later, how do you continue to interact with them? And where's your marketing campaigns? And is there any way to continue to build a relationship and monetize that relationship? And I'm starting to ask the questions. And what I found is that when I sit and have these conversations, that the leaders of these companies really appreciate that because they say, boy, you really understand our business. Now, help us fix these one or two issues that we're having in these particular experiences. but we take the conversation much higher around the overall brand.
So when you get a chance to meet with a RightNow client, what recommendations do you offer around providing their customers with optimal experiences?
The first thing I tell them is knowledge is key. And knowledge is a very interesting thing. Some people think of knowledge as, oh, well, you just need to have a knowledge base with a bunch of information in it. And that is true. But what you really need to do is think about knowledge as a two-way street. Every interaction, you actually collect knowledge about the customer and you actually give knowledge to the customer. And collecting both sides of that interaction is crucial. And you've got to understand that knowledge at every touch point. There are many situations that I've seen in companies, including BestBuy when I first started there, that knowledge was transferred to the customer and collected, but it was never put into a central repository where people could look at all that information and determine what was going on with the overall relationship. So they were just looking at snapshots versus looking at the entire book. So that's the first thing that I recommend to people. The second thing is that you really need to map out every one of those touch points. As I've said earlier, is that you really need to understand, well, how does the customer see your brand and where do they see it? And do you have control over that experience? So if you happen to produce a product and that product gets featured in retail, do you understand how the customer is interacting at retail with that product? Because that's an interaction with your brand. Do you have a way to measure that experience? Do you have a way to collect the data on that experience? Do you have a way to check with the customer and ensure that they had the experience that they wanted? So I think it's extremely important to understand all those touch points. And I've worked with companies before that have actually missed one or two touch points, and those actually end up being the touch points that tarnish the brand and cause customers to go somewhere else. The third piece I really recommend is that you've got to think about, well, how do I deliver a compelling experience at each of those touch points? And to do that, I need to think about the customer from the segment level. And a lot of people think, well, I just serve everyone and I delight everyone. And Tom, you know the old saying, which is if you try to delight everyone, you end up delighting no one. And I think it's important for companies to understand who is your chief customer, who is the target that you're going after, who is the segment that you really want to delight, and make sure the value propositions and the experiences that you have for your brand meet bullseye with that particular customer, and that they feel like it's a personal experience designed for them. Now, you can serve many segments, but you can only delight a few. So it's extremely important for companies to be really clear about who is it that we want to delight.
Brian, thanks so much for sharing your experiences with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks, Tom.